Hey everybody, in this video we're going to be painting a really exciting miniature. This one's going to be the Harbinger of Decay for Warhammer Age of Sigmar by Games Workshop. And in our humble opinion, this miniature is one of the best fantasy miniatures that Games Workshop has put out in a long time because it's fantastic. And to be honest, we wouldn't be surprised to see this being a Golden Demon winner at some point because it's really a painter's miniature. But in this video, what we're going to be doing is showing you a great way of painting it from start to finish using lots of techniques that are very simple to replicate and look great to help you get a really fantastic result on the tabletop. And at the same time, we're going to go over a number of techniques that can be applied to all sorts of Nurgle miniatures. So we hope you enjoy it. Let's get to it. To paint the Harbinger of Decay, you can see I've actually built it with no sub-assemblies at all, and that's due to the quite complex interlocking nature of how the miniature builds, although in this case we don't really need to worry about sub-assemblies because we can still fairly easily access all the details. But there are quite a lot of details on there, and some of them overlay each other quite a bit, so what we're going to do is approach painting this miniature with that in mind. It means we need to start with the deepest area, which is going to be the flesh of the horse, and this means what we can do is dry brush it to start to bring out some of that texture, start to make it look a little bit dry, like cracking skin, things like that, so perfect for Nurgle. And so what we need to do is start out with an undercoat that brings that into mind, and so in this case I've used some Zandri dust spray. Now this is the perfect starting point for all the colours we're going to be using, particularly that horse flesh where it actually forms the first base coat. So bear in mind if you have gone for a different undercoat colour, so for example a grey or something like that, you'll need to make sure you paint all of that horse flesh and hair with Zandri dust before you begin. But what we're going to do, because it's already that colour, is jump straight into dry brushing over it, start to bring out some texture and some, some highlights and things like that on it. For this, what I've got is some Ushabti bone, and to apply it, we want a small dry brush. That's exactly what I've got here from Citadel. A small dry brush just here. All we need to do is get a small amount of the paint on the tip of the brush, then on some tissue start working it into the bristles. Now we're aiming for a soft application here, which means we really need to make sure that we work most of that paint in there and remove a lot of the excess. We want to bring it right down to this point here in the paper texture. You can see hardly any colours now catching that paper, so that's ideal for what we want here. This means we can steadily build it up and get it to the point where we need it to be. And what we're looking for is the flesh such as around here, and the way to apply it is in a rounded motion like this, so quite softly, and this way the more you do it, the more the colour will build up and start to pick out some of that detail on there. So we just want to go around areas like this, just working at it so it goes lighter and lighter up to around the point I'm starting to get around the horse's shoulders just there. Now this will include all the parts of the horse flesh that go greenish, so that means we've got to take it down its legs, so areas like this, but at this stage we want to do our best to avoid the hair if we can. It doesn't really matter if you catch some of it, but just try and keep it to a minimum because we're going to be taking that in a slightly different direction when we start adding a bit of wash over the top of it. As for the other details that are interlaced around the miniature, don't worry about them for the time being because we'll neaten those up as we go along. So for example, you can see all this fabric here that goes around that little bit of flesh that's visible in that gap. What we want to do is just make sure we get some of this colour into that gap, and it doesn't matter about this fabric here because we'll come back to that later on. Steadily keep on with dry brushing until you build the colour up to this point on that horse flesh, and then it's time to apply our first wash onto the miniature, and in this case for that sickly feel what we need is a sepia coloured wash. So in this case I'm going to be using some Archaic sepia wash, and to apply it we want a big brush now, so I'm using a medium shade brush here from Citadel, and with this we want to go over all that flesh that we just dry brushed, but also this time we can now bring it over all the hair as well. So we are going to be painting the entire horse at this stage. So we just need to load up a generous amount on the brush and then start looking for these features and apply the paint directly over them. So for example around here, I just want to paint it on like this just to make sure it works into all the nooks and crannies, but also just keep it moving and just make sure it doesn't build up a lot in any one particular area. So we're just looking out for any splotches or anything like that, just pushing it away from those parts and moving the paint around as far as it will go. Now, as I mentioned, we want to bring it onto the hair too, so that includes the mane going down here. We want to bring it all the way down, working it into all those recesses, but also be sure to get the tail and all the hair that appears around the hooves as well. The wash is now on, and at this stage just make sure it's completely dry before you move on to this next step, because what we now need to do is dry brush it once again using some Ushabti bone. So just to re-establish that paler colour on the horse flesh, and this time we can start to use it on that hair as well. Start to highlight that and pick out the texture before we start adding a tint of green to it. So Ushabti bone is the colour once again, and I'm using that small dry brush to apply it, and the application is going to be on the horse flesh exactly the same as what we just did on that first step. So like before, just make sure you work that paint into the brush and then really go along with that paper to remove the excess until there's hardly hardly anything left. So I'll go down to about that point there, and then we're ready to start applying it in that same motion we did before. So that soft rounded motion to start to pick out the flesh on the horse, so very gently like this, so we can start to bring this colour back on those raised areas and pick out that texture there like that. And also at this stage we can now start going over the hair. Now when it comes to the hair, what we need to do is make sure we're going in this direction across it so as to catch the bristle, or the raised strands really of it. So I want the bristles to go back and forth like this, just working our way down, and this way you can see we get that nice highlight appearing on that texture. Once you're happy with that second dry brush, the next thing we need to do is apply a second wash, but this time it's going to be a different colour. What we need is a sort of brownish green colour here to introduce those greenish tones that appear on the horse flesh and hair. So in this case I'm going to be using some Necrosis green wash, and to apply it now you want to switch down to a medium brush for a bit more control. In this case I'm using a size 1 from Archaic, but from Citadel a medium layer will be perfect. And whichever you choose, what we need to do first of all is just start out with a very small amount, because what we want to do is firstly wash this around a little maggot that appears on the body, which is right here. If you spot any other maggots, just do it in the same way, just paint it directly over the top of them so it stains them green and you get some of that green settling around the outside. However, what we're looking at really is going to be painting all the horse hair and greenish tones that appear on the legs, and to do this we're looking for areas like the mane just here, where what we want to do is start in the strongest part of it, so just along the top, just running it along here, making sure we work it into all the strands of that hair. Then once you've got it on here, we can start bringing it down the side, and the green tends to be more focused towards the top. So we want to go around this sort of area just here, just again painting it into all those corners, making sure it covers nicely. And then we want to bring it down to a little bit over halfway. Now once you get to that point, what we need to do is stop whilst that paint is still wet. So bring it down to there whilst the paint's still damp, then wash your brush, just make sure it's damp with a little bit of water, so not soaking or anything. And then with it we can just start pulling that paint down, and this way you can see it fades out. So the green is now stronger towards the top and gets lighter the further down we go. Now what we need to do is let this dry completely, and then we're going to come back to it with a second coat. So whilst that first one's drying, we can just carry on with all the remaining hair. Bear in mind the horse's legs tend to go greenish like this too, and the technique is just the same. So for example this leg just here around all these maggots that are down here, so I'm going to paint it into this region, and again just like with that mane, once you've got a certain amount on, just wash your brush, make sure it's damp, and then just use that to smudge it almost, just drawing it up a little bit, and this way you get that nice fading between the two colours. Once that first coat's dry, we're then ready to go in for another coat of Necrosis green wash once again, and with this it's pretty much the same technique as what we did before, just again focusing on the hair towards the top of it where the colour needs to be darker, so around this region just here, bringing it down to about that same point, and then just like before, wash your brush whilst that wash is still dry, just make sure it's damp with a little bit of water, and then just use it just to pull it down so it fades out. On the legs it's the exact same thing, again just focusing on the areas where you want the green to be stronger, and then it's really up to you exactly how many times you do this, because every successive coat will make that green stronger. So just carry on doing this technique until you're happy with the result. And here we have the model with that green wash applied, and in the end I went for 3 coats, but you can of course add more if you want to, but I'm happy with it at this point. So now we're going to move on to the next stage, which is going to be to tie these colours together on the horse. To do this we need to dry brush it once again, but this time with a lighter bone colour. So here I'm going to use some Vampire Fang, and to apply it I'm back with that small dry brush. And here it's the same sort of process of what we were doing with the previous colour with Ushabti bone, but just lighter this time. So this time on the tissue, really make sure to get rid of most of that paint. Really work it into your brush, going along until there's hardly anything left on there, and then when you're ready it's just a matter of lightly applying it. And this time we're looking for more of a flicking motion, so just very gently like this, just very very lightly over the top, and if I go slowly you can see the sort of motion I'm making just there. So very gently on it, and this way the paint will only catch sharper corners and reach texture, so we get that highlight starting to show through. And when it comes to the hair it's the same process, but again making sure that we're going across the strands very lightly, just working our way down to get that nice highlight on these areas. And with that done, we're now going to leave the horse for the time being and start painting some other details around the miniature. And we'll come back to it later for some fine details like saws and things like that. But now what we need to do is start applying some base coats elsewhere on the miniature. And what we're now looking to do is to base coat a whole load of colours that can all be washed with the same colour wash at the same time. So this way, what we can do is efficiently shade them all and tie them all together. So what we're going to do is start out with the green robes. And here it's entirely up to you what sort of shades of green you go for. But in this case, what we're going to do is start out with some Castellan green, which is a fantastic go-to green green if you're doing Nurgle. Really nice sort of olivey colour, this one. And to apply it, I'm using my size 1 brush once again. So a really good sized brush for this. It's like a medium sort of one is what you want to go for. This way you can control exactly where you're applying it, because there's a particular layer of robes we're looking for with this colour. Essentially the ones that are around the centre of the miniature. So once you've got that thinned down and ready, we can start looking for that. And really it's these robes that are hanging from his body. So they actually go down around here. You can see going down the side of the horse on both sides, going around here. And when we're blocking this in, we can be fairly quick as we do it. But anytime you do come near to horse flesh, just be careful around those parts so as to not catch that as you're going along. Now this layer of robes does go up to the body, and what we're looking at is the ones that go around the waist. So underneath the sleeves, going up to around here. I finished with Castellan green there on the robes, and I also decided to paint it on the hood as well just there. And with that done, we can now move on to another shade of green to paint all the remaining fabric. And once again, what you want to do is pick a sort of murky green colour. In this case, I've gone for a slightly lighter one, so some Deathworld Forest. And to apply it, I'm going to do the exact same technique. So I'm using my size 1 brush once again. And as before, we just need to get this on the palette and thin it down to make sure it's really nice and smooth before we start to apply it. And this is also going to help out with the accuracy too, because this time we also need to paint that fabric that forms the barding on the horse. So as we apply this, we've got to be careful about avoiding all that horse flesh. So for example, on the fabric just around here, you can see as we apply it, it does get close to that flesh as we get near the top just there. So just really take your time as you get around that region. So at this stage, we're looking at all the fabric that appears on the horse. So all the way around here, going all the way down, and on the other side too. But as for the rider, it's going to be the layer that goes around the middle of his body. So we're looking at areas such as the sleeves around here. And there we are. With that, all the fabric is now base coated. You can see on both sides of the miniature. And so now we're going to move on to another shade of green, this time for the armour. And like on the box here, we're going to go for a slightly sort of jadish kind of green to be a nice contrast from the other greens we've got. So for this, we're going to start out with some Incubi darkness. Now to begin with, I'm still going to use my size 1 brush, but you might want to have a smaller one on hand for when you're doing the more tricky to reach areas. In this case, I'm talking specifically about the helmet, when you're trying to get to that underneath the hood. So just bear that in mind as you get to that area. But for the rest of it, a brush of this size is great. And as always, just need to make sure the paint's thinned and under control, and then we can start looking for all the armour plates. So for example, the shoulder plate just here, what we want to do is block it in, just being really neat as we get close to those robes. And there we are, the armour's base coated, so now it's time to move away from painting greens to start to base coat other colours that appear in the miniature, and we'll start out with some browns and a black. So what we'll do is start out with a nice warm brown, so some Mornfang brown to begin with. Then after that we'll need an even warmer brown, so in this case we're going to be using some Boar Hide to pick out some select details. Then after that we're going to go for an off black, and here I'm going to use some Death Reaper. But first of all, what we need is some Mornfang brown, and to apply it I'm going for the size 1 brush once again, but you might want to have a smaller one on hand because this colour is going to be the reins and wood that appears in the miniature, and the reins can be a bit tricky to get to, so have a smaller brush on hand for that. You can see this colour's great for Nurgle because it's got that nice sort of rusty orange feel to it, so ideal for this colour palette. And so what we want to do now is start looking for these features. So it's going to be areas like the wood to begin with, such as this shield just here, where we just want to base coat all the planks. Not worrying about the metal for the time being, but just be careful when you get close to those robes. But also we've got the reins too, and this is where it can get a little bit trickier, so you might want to have that smaller brush on hand for this area, but essentially it's all these straps that go around the head of the horse and then go up to the rider's hands. Once you've finished with Mornfang brown, we're then ready to move on to another brown. In this case, it's some Boar Hide. And with this, we're looking for the grips of the weapons. So for example, we've got the grip of his sword just here, and there is the scythe around here. And be careful with the scythe, just working amongst those other details we've base coated so far. In addition, this is a great colour to pick out some other details that are leather. So for example, some of these little pouches. And then finally we can move on to an off black. So in this case I'm using some Death Reaper, and this is first of all going to be for all the rope that appears in the miniature, and it is scattered all around it, so just keep an eye out. And for this it's time to maybe switch down to a smaller brush, which is exactly what I've done. I'm using my size 0 here for a little bit more control as I work around this area. Now in addition we need to make sure we get the scabbard as well, which is entirely this colour, so be sure to block this in. And we've also got this bird at the back, this crow up top here, so we also want to make sure we paint all of its feathers at this stage. One last thing to get at this stage is the hooves of the horse as well, so be sure to base coat them too. Now that we've got those colours base coated, we're ready to move on to some more base coats, and now it's time to put the metallics on the miniature. And here we need two. First of all, we want a darker silver, so for this I'm going to use some Surcoat silver, and then we need a bronze as well. In this case I'm going to use some Spartan Bronze. But first of all, what we need is that silver, so I'm going to use some Surcoat silver, and I'm starting out with my size 0 brush again, but these silver details are all shapes and sizes and they're scattered across the entire miniature, so change brush size as you need to, depending on what you're doing or what you're comfortable with. I would definitely recommend you use some reference from the box art to guide you through this part, because as I say, these features are scattered all across it, and some are really small, some are quite large, some are quite tricky to paint around as well, such as the chainmail links around here, because they're all interlaced with the fabric. So just take your time in this stage, just being as neat as you can, just looking for those parts that need to be silver and just gently moving in and picking them out. Once you've found all that silver, you're then ready to move on to painting some bronze, and here I'm using some Spartan Bronze. This is going to be a great colour to mix up some bits of metal and also pick out some more decorative features and things where we want to draw attention to them. So for example, we've got this metal design right in the middle of his helmet right there, but also we can keep an eye out for any trinkets such as this little fly trinket that's hanging down just here, and also watch out for any bells such as this one round here as well. Now that we've found all that metal, we can move on to a few more base coats, which are the last ones before we move on to applying that wash to these colours. And for this, what we need to do first of all is neaten up all the bone details. And for this, I'm going to use some Dragon Fang. Now, once that's done, there's a few little select parts of wood that we still need to get. And here I'm going to use some Scorched Earth. But then finally, we've got some skin that we need to paint on the various severed heads and things. And for this, I'm going to be using some Elven skin. But first of all, what we need is Dragon Fang. And for this, I'm sticking to the size 0 brush. But as usual, feel free to change as you need to, depending on the detail you're doing. And here we're looking for all the bone features, which are generally going to be skulls and things that are scattered around the miniature like trophies, so look out for those. But also what we need to do is make sure we neaten up the bone that appears on the horse around its face, and that's just down here. So I'm going to base coat this area here. You can see the exposed bone just on the very end around its mouth. But also we've got a horn on this head, so what we need to do is just neaten that up too. So we just want to block this one in all around here. With that bone detail cleaned up, we're now ready to move on to base coating another shade of brown. This is going to be Scorched Earth, and this is first of all for the haft of the scythe, so all the way around here, but also we've got this wooden beam that goes across the back of the horse, and we need to make sure we base coat this at this stage as well. And then finally we need some elven skin, and for this we're looking to paint the flesh on these severed heads. So for example on this one we've got some flesh around about here, and this one has some flesh going just across the front around here too. But also don't forget there's a tentacle growing out of his head, and this is a great colour to base coat this as well. And there we are. With that, we've now finished applying all of those base coats, and so what we can do is now apply that wash over all of them to shade them all at the same time and sort of really embed them together and start to get that definition on the miniature. And what we need now is a dark brown wash. So here I'm going to use some Battle Mud wash, and to apply it I'm actually going to be starting out with my size 1 brush. Now you could go for a larger brush at times if you want to, but just bear in mind you need to be careful with this because we want to get on every colour that we've added since we did that horse flesh and hair, so we need to be careful to avoid those parts. So that's why I'm going for a brush of this size, and you can see I'm being really generous with that initial load up on there, because what I'm going to do is pick a starting point that's going to be in the middle of some details away from that horse flesh. So for example, the fabrics around here, we can start by applying it in this sort of region like this and just moving it over these areas. As we get close to that horse flesh at the edges, that means that we can just start pulling the wash up and be careful as it goes on. So for example, if I bring it up towards the top just here where it meets that flesh as the rope goes around the body, what we can now do is just start picking up some wash from these areas and just redistributing it around these parts. So you can see it's quite a meticulous application here, but it's definitely worth putting in the time and patience, because this way we're going to get a nice neat definition and that shading, and also avoid getting it onto that horse flesh. And here we have the model with that wash now completely dry, and you can see what I mean about how it's really embedded all those colours together and really marked out all the details. So with that done, what we can now do is a little bit of layering to start to brighten some of the colours up before we move into highlights. And what we're going to do is start out with the armour, which is going to be a little bit different to how we're going to do the other layers, because here what we're going to do is put the colour on really thinly, so almost glazing it, start to add a bit of depth to that colour. Now what we need here is Cabalite green, and to apply it I'm going to be using a small brush. I've gone right down to a size 00 here. What we want to do is just get some of this onto the palette and then thin it really heavily down with water. So you can see I'm adding quite a bit to it on the side of the pigment there on the palette, drawing in a little bit of the colour and making a very, very thin version of the paint there like that. So nice and translucent, you see. So what we want to do is make sure we only have a small amount on the brush, and on these armor panels, what we're aiming to do is to apply it as a fairly broad layer. So what we're looking at doing there really is applying it over the flat areas whilst avoiding the recesses. So on this foot just here, I'm going on that end piece, and I'm not going quite into that recess where it meets that other panel. I'm going to skip past the darkest part and carry on again on the other side. Now you can see because I'm applying this so thinly, there's not really much to be seen with this first coat, and it dries pretty quickly as well. And on all these panels, I'm always looking for the edges to focus around, but I'm just being careful not to drop into those areas of shadow. Now once that first coat's dry, we just go back with a second coat and focus it a little bit closer towards the end of each panel. So in the case of the foot now, we're going to be a little bit further down here. So now you can see that green start to get brighter on that edge. Same on this part just here, where I'm just going to focus it a little bit close towards the edge of that panel. Then once that's dry, just do a third coat even closer to the edge. So just around there. And you can see by doing that, we've now got that gradient of colour and got a really nice rich green starting to build up. And with that, the armour is now layered, and you can see it starting to enrich that green nicely, and we'll come back to that later on with a highlight to really set it off. But before we do so, there's still a little bit more layering to do, and we're now going to look at those green fabrics. So for this, we'll first of all return to some Castellan green, and to apply it, I'm again going to stick to my size 00 brush, but you might want to go for a larger one if you want to here. Essentially what we want to do is retrace our steps over the fabric that we originally base coated with this colour, but this time just be more selective about where exactly it's going to go. We want to be careful to avoid the recesses and instead just stick onto the raised up areas. So, for example, take a look at the fabric that's draping down the side just here. What we want to do is look for parts that are standing out, such as just here. Whenever we get close to that recess, such as this one just behind that fold right there, just don't drop directly into the darkest part. So just skip past it and carry on again on the other side, so just along there. So once again, you can see a recess right there, so we're just going to skip past it, carry on with this little bit here, skip past that recess there, and then just do a bit there. So see, in this way, what we're doing is starting to clean up that colour and make it a bit brighter, but we're also retaining the definition from that wash. And there we are, the first of the green fabrics has been layered, so it's now time to move on to the second one, and for this we're going to return again to the original colour we used here, which is going to be Deathworld Forest. Now once that's done, we can layer the bone details, and here we can go a little bit lighter, so we're going to use some Ushabti bone here, and once that's done we can then layer the skin, and for this we're going to go back to Elven skin. But first of all, what we need is that Deathworld Forest, and to apply it I'm going to stick to the same brush, so still that size 00, and with this, again, it's a matter of layering it on just like we did with that previous green. So just need to make sure that paint's nice and thin, under control, and then it's time to look for this colour of fabric. So we're looking at areas such as this piece that's on the horse down here. Once again, we're looking to apply it onto the flat raised areas such as this part just here, but when it creases in and goes darker, I'm just going to skip past the darkest area and carry on again on the other side. With that done on the fabric, the next thing to layer is going to be the bone detail, and for this we're going to use some Ushabti bone, and what we're looking at is again to apply it on the flatter areas whilst carefully avoiding those recesses once more. So for example, on the front of the horse just here where its mouth is, you can see I'm just carefully applying it onto this flatter part just here, but I'm not going into that deeper recess where it meets the flesh around there. So this way we're retaining that definition. And then finally, we just need to do a little bit of layering on all this flesh. And for this, returning to Elven skin. And again, this is a layering technique, so we're looking to carefully avoid those recesses. So for example, on the head just here, you see I'm just being really careful around those parts. But don't forget to do the tentacle as well, where we're looking to do the same thing, just following these ridges all the way along it. And with that, the layering phase is now complete, and so we can move on to the highlighting stage. And for this, we're actually going to start out with a little bit of dry brushing. And the reason why we're going to do it now is because inevitably, as we do the dry brushing technique, we are going to catch the edges of some surrounding details. This means, though, that when we move on to edge highlighting these later on, we're going to paint over any parts the dry brushing has caught, and thereby neaten up as we go along. So if we do it now, we'll be able to fix it as we continue. So what we need to do is to dry brush the wooden details to bring out the texture. And for this, we're going to start out with a medium brown, and here I've got some wasteland brown. Then we need to move on to a lighter, almost khaki colour. So for this, I'm going to be using some temple stone. But first of all, what we need is that wasteland brown, and to apply it, you definitely want a small dry brush. And that's exactly what I've got here from Citadel. Just need a small amount of this on the brush, and then on that tissue, really work it into the bristles and remove the excess. So just like earlier when we were dry brushing, I'm going to do this very lightly and very gradually to control the build-up of it. So really work that paint away on the paper until you're starting to get this sort of appearance just here, and then we're ready to start applying it. And so we're looking for all the wood here. So for example, the shield, just want to gently go in and start brushing it on that texture in this sort of direction. See what I mean about how we are going to catch the edges of some of that silver, but it's not a problem because we'll neaten that up later on. So around there as well, making sure we get all of those planks. In addition, we've got the darker woods, such as the haft of the scythe, and we want to make sure we dry brush on this as well. Again, just taking our time and being as neat as possible. Once that's done, we can then move on to some temple stone, and this is another dry brush on the wooden details, just a little bit lighter this time, just to pick out some of that finer texture. Once you're happy with those dry brushed highlights for the wood, we're then ready to move on to a more careful application of some highlights for other details on the miniatures, starting out with those green robes. And the first colour we're going to use here is Lauren Forest. Now this is for that darker green, and so to do it, what we need is a fine brush to apply it. So I'm using my size 00 once again here, and what we want to do is just get some of this ready on the palette. And the key thing here is to look to thin it down so it flows really easily from your brush, because now we need some fine control, looking for raised details and edges and basically following along each of those. So just test it on your palette until you're happy with the consistency, and so it feels really smooth to you and it flows well from the brush. Then we're ready to start looking for these features. So as I mentioned, we're looking for the darker green, which is that green that's more around the centre of the miniature, just around here. And first of all, we want to go for the hem. For this, we can actually skim along with the side of the brush, so very gently along this edge, just along here where it stands out. And this way we get that nice highlight following that area there like that. Now there are creases where we can't quite do that because it's tricky to get to them. For example, these ones just here. So in this case, we have to use the tip of the brush, and it's just a matter of making sure you're comfortable and applying it following the crease of the fabric there, just in the peak of it. So the raised area, this way we get a highlight following that detail. So once again, on this one just here too, there's also a bit of a crease just going down this part here and down the front of the shield. So I just want to follow these all the way around, also keeping an eye out for any rips and tears and going around those as well. Once you've finished that highlight on the darker green, it's then time to move on to highlighting the lighter green, and at the same time what we can do is use the same colour as a fine highlight on that darker green. Now the one we're going to use here is Elysian green, and then once that's been applied we can add a fine highlight to the lighter green areas. In this case we're going to use some Ogrin camo. But first of all we need some Elysian green, and in this case it's again a matter of using that small brush, so I'm still using my size 00 here, and the application is going to be identical to what we just did using Lauren Forest. So once again we're looking for the edges, the creases, that sort of thing on the fabric. So make sure that paint's nice and smooth and flowing well, and then it's time to start looking for these features. And so for example, you can see the lighter green that's around the body just here. We're again looking for the edges first of all, and you can use the side of your brush. A little bit tricky to get to some of these parts, but it is possible if you just gently skim your way along to get that highlight following the edge of it, going the hem all the way around. But also we need to keep an eye out for any larger creases and any defining lines on them, such as just here. We want to go along those, then go around the outside of the rips and tears and things as well. So it's like this all the way around. Now when we get to that darker green, we can use it as that fine highlight as I mentioned. And in this case, we're looking for parts that stand out more, such as this peak of the fabric as it goes around the foot just there. What we're going to do is just follow that highlight that we did previously, but just focus it on the sharpest part. So just very gently skimming it on, just for a highlight to help that bit pop out a little bit more there like that. With that highlight applied, we're now ready to move on to some Ogrin camo, and this is going to be a fine highlight on the lighter green parts only. So essentially the same technique as what we've just done on the darker green, where we're looking for the parts that stand out, and it's just a matter of just flicking a small amount of this colour on those areas just to help them pop that little bit more. And with that, all that green fabric is now highlighted both on the rider and on the mount. So we can move on to the next feature that we need to highlight, which is going to be the armour. And here we've got that sort of jade green kind of colour. So the highlight to use here is going to be some Sybarite green. Now Sybarite green is a very bright, sharp green. So this is going to be quite bright compared to the sort of theme that we're going for here with Nurgle, with all that decay. So once it's on, what we need to do is just take the edge off it slightly and just mute it down. And for this we need a bone colour. So here I'm going to use some Vampire Fang. But first of all we need that Sybarite green, and to apply it, stick to your small brush. So I'm still using my size 00 here, and this is just going to be an edge highlight, and you can see as I get on the palette what I mean about how bright this colour is. So that's why we're going to be toning it down a little bit afterwards. But for this first coat, just make sure you get it nice and thin, and then we're ready for all the sharp edges that appear on the armour. So on the faceplate, for example, you can see it has a ridge going right down the centre. So what we want to do is just very carefully trace on the peak of that line. So just a very, very fine line going down there like that using the tip of the brush. And on the underside of the helmet, we can follow the edge of it. So it's going to be on that side just there. and then on this side just here. And you can see I'm always turning the model to make sure I'm comfortable as I apply this, and this way we'll have the maximum accuracy as we start going around all these corners and edges. So it's always going to be things like that. Once again, as we move on to the shoulder plate, we're looking for the outer edge of it and also that ridge down the center, and we just want to make sure we're nice and comfy and then gently start following that edge as narrowly as possible with a fine line of this color. Once that's done, we're then ready to move on to a fine highlight using some Vampire Fang. And this is just going to be a very delicate edge highlight on these green armor panels, again following the steps we did earlier, but this time looking for those sharp corners once again. So on the helmet, for example, we're just looking at the very base of it right there. On the shoulder plate, it's going to be things such as the rivets that are just there, but also we're looking for these sharp corners that appear on areas like just down here. Also, we've got a tighter corner just around here we want to get it. So it's just small areas like this, just to tie this color in with the rest of the miniature. And with that done, the armour is now complete too, and so now it's time to move on to some of the smaller details that need highlighting. And so for this, what we'll do is start out with all those leather straps. For this, we're going to use some fur cloak. Now once that's done, there's the black detail to highlight, and here we'll start with a dark grey, so some Dungeonstone grey, then move on to a light grey to finish those parts off. So here we'll use some Kagaradon grey. But first of all, we need some fur cloak, and to apply it I'm using the same brush, so again that's size 00, and here we're looking to pick out the edges on all the straps and things that we've got around the miniature, and also those pouches and things. We're looking for parts that stand out there too. So what we want to do is approach it as if we were edge highlighting, making sure that paint's nice and smooth, nice and thin as well, and then we're ready to look for these edges. So for example on the reins, we're looking for the outer edge where we just want to use the side of the brush and just very gently skim along so we can pick out that area along there. So just following it all the way around so we get that nice highlight going along that edge there like that. But also keep an eye out for all the other details in this sort of colour. So for example, things such as these pouches, again we're looking for sharper edges and details. We just want to follow around each one. With that done, we're then ready to move on to highlighting the black, and for this, first of all, what we need is a dark grey, so I'm using some Dungeonstone grey. And to begin with, we've got the ropes where we're looking for that texture, so it's just going to be a few lines following these strands along as they work their way around the miniature. So for example, just following these lines are working their way along here, but we're also going to have to highlight the crow here. Now, when it comes to the feathers, we're looking for a highlight again, so look for that texture and just apply a few lines following those feathers to help them stand out. But when it comes to areas like the beak and the feet, in this case, just do a layer and we'll add a further highlight to these parts later on. And once that's done, we can then move on to some Kagaradon grey. Now with this on the ropes, first of all we want to do is just dot a little bit of this colour along the top of them just to help that texture stand out more. So it's just small amounts along areas such as just along here. And then when it comes to the crow, what we want to do is just get a fine highlight on the parts of the feathers where they stand out. So down this wing, for example, you can see these little areas, these feathers here that we just want to pick out. When it comes to the beak and the feet, here we can just highlight, so edge highlighting essentially just to follow on these sharper edges such as along here. And with that, we're now well on the way to having the miniature highlighted, and we're going to come back to that crow later on, but what we now need to do is turn our attention to the metallics, and here we'll need two colours. First we need a bright silver, so here I'm going to be using some Mithril Blade, and then we've got to paint all of that bronze detail. Here I'm going to be using some Sycorax Bronze. But first of all, what we need is that Mithril Blade, and to apply it, stick to your small brush, because here it's going to be just edge highlighting on these features, except for the chainmail, which is a little bit different. But for all the more solid parts of silver, it's going to be edge highlighting, so we just need to get that paint ready for the purpose, making sure it's nice and smooth and flowing well. Then it's time to start looking for all those sharper edges and corners on the silver detail. So for example on the shield, we've got this trim on it and the design in the middle. Want to, where possible, approach the side of the brush and just gently skim along to get that bright silver line following that edge there like that to help it pop. But when we can't quite reach it with the side of the brush, it's time to use the tip of it. So just make sure you're really comfortable, nice and steady, and just gradually work your way along to get that highlight on that area. Now when it comes to the chainmail, just make sure you don't have much paint on your brush, and the application here is almost like dry brushing, though a bit more precise. What we want to do is work in a downward motion like this, just gently letting the tip of the brush just flick across that texture. And this way it'll pick it out and give it a nice highlight. And with that done, we're then ready to move on to the bronze detail, and for this we need some Sycorax Bronze applied in the exact same way. And there we are, all those metallic details are now highlighted, so we've just got a few more things that we need to highlight now. So here what we're looking at is the bone and the flesh. So for the bone colours, we need a light bone colour, so here we're going to return to some Vampire Fang. And for the flesh, we need a really pale flesh this time, so here I'm going to use some Flayed One flesh. But first of all, what we need is Vampire Fang, and to apply it, it's a matter of using that same brush once again. So I'm back to my size 00 here. We just need a small amount, and with this colour, we're now looking to pick out the sharpest details on all the bone features on the miniatures, which in the case of the skulls, that are partially obscured by the flesh. We're just looking for parts of the bone that do stand out, such as on this head back here. You can see we've got the ridge of the brow going around here, so we just want to make sure we pick that out going around that eye just there. We can also pick out the eye itself. Then we've got around the nose too. So areas like that and all those bone details. Same is true when we get to the mouth of the mount, where we're looking for these sharp edges, such as around here, then following it down just around the nose just there. But don't forget too, we do have the crow back here, and in this case what we want to do is a fine highlight on the beak and the feet. So just a small amount of this, but it's just to help separate it from those black feathers. And with that bone detail highlighted, it's now time to highlight all the flesh. And for this, we're using some Flayed One flesh. And again, we're looking for details that stand out, sharper edges, things like that. So for example, on this ripped skin on this face just here, you can see I'm looking for these parts that are just hanging up from this hook. So we just want to get those ridges that are standing out. Now, in addition, don't forget to highlight the tentacle on his head at this stage. And here we just want to follow on that texture of it with a few lines just to help bring out this texture too. And with that, all those core details of the miniature are now highlighted. So what we're going to do now is move on to painting some of the fun stuff to really finish the miniature off. And the first of these is going to be all those exposed wounds that appear on the mount. Now to do this, we need to start out with a burgundy base coat. So I'm going to use some Sword Hilt Burgundy here. And then once that's dry, we'll wash over it with some Caribou Crimson. But first of all, we need that Sword Hilt Burgundy. And to apply it, I recommend sticking to your small brush, because this time we're painting this colour in amongst other details. And we want to thin it down a fair amount, so it's a little bit runny. Bring it down to about that sort of point just there, and then all we've got to do is start painting it into these exposed areas. And what I'm talking about are areas such as this bit of flesh right here, where you can see the skin's peeled back and we've got some of that muscle underneath. I just want to very neatly block this in at this stage. You can see having that paint thin down really helps out with this, because it's quite easy to run it into that area. Just let it fill it up and stain it with that colour. Now this will bring us down to areas such as the boils, and now, well, we're looking at these ones around here. Now at this stage we want to make sure they're all burgundy too, and we'll come back to them later on to make them yellow, but for now we just need to make sure they look all really sore, so be sure to get it in these areas as well. Once you've found all those open wounds, the next thing to do is apply a red wash over them. So in this case, I'm using some Caribou Crimson, applied again using that size 00 brush. And with this, you just need to be careful, making sure just to keep it over these parts, just so you get that depth and definition in these areas. Once the wash is dry, we're then ready to move on to the next step, which is to use the wash a little bit more, because now what we need to do is start staining in a sort of pinkish colour on the horse flesh to create the impression of those sore wounds. And for this, again, we need some Caribou Crimson, but this time we're going to thin it down with some Lamium Medium, which is going to take the edge off the strength of the colour while still retaining the same properties of the paint. So this way it's still going to dry smoothly. So what we need to do is create that mix on the palette, and to do it I'm actually going to use my small brush again. So I'm still using the 00 because we want to be quite controlled exactly how we apply this. You can go for a bigger one if you want to. What I'm going to do is create a roughly 50-50 mix. So that's 3 brushfuls just there. And we can grab some of that medium, and to be careful to make sure that you don't contaminate the medium with any colour. It's always a good idea to wash your brush before you grab some. But again, 1, 2 and 3, and then we can mix those together, and this way you see we now got that diluted version of that wash. So with that prepared, what we're ready to do is start applying this onto areas where we want to give the impression that things are really sore. So for example, if you look around the 3 boils that we've got here, which are like the mark of Nurgle, this is a great place to do it. And what we want to do is just thinly apply it over the flesh, such as just there and around this region just here where we've got these splits in the skin. And you can see because the medium, it's nice and thin and it's quite subtle at this point. That's ideal, because what we can do is apply it to a certain area, such as around there, then quickly wash your brush, make sure it's just damp, and then just use it to draw it out, just like we did with that green wash earlier on, to make sure it fades into its surroundings. Now the idea of doing it so thinly like this is that it allows us control in building it up, which means once this coat's completely dry, apply a second coat in the exact same way over the top, and this way it's nice and easy to get that smooth gradient going from the pinker areas into the green sort of flesh around it. Carry on building up that colour until you're happy, and in this case I did 3 coats to get that really sore appearance there in the flesh, and also you can see I brought it over some of the other wounds, including some of these little boils, such as a little one just there, and there's a few little ones just clustered down there, and over the eye as well. I also added just a little touch over some of the flesh on these severed heads. And with that done, what we can now do is start highlighting all these features. For this, first of all, what we need to do is look at the open wounds, and here we need a sort of pinkish colour, so I'm going to use some glistening gums for this. Then we need to move on to a light bone colour, so here I'm going to use some Vampire Fang, and this is going to be for an overall highlight that appears on the mount, just to help finish it off and tie these different shades that we got on there together. But first we need some glistening gums, and to apply it again, go for your small brush, so still with that size 00 here, what we want to do is just get a little bit of this, and we really don't need very much, just nicely thin down so it's a bit translucent. And then with it we're looking for these open wounds where there's a bit of texture in them. So for example, if we take a look at this one just here, see there's a few little bumps and things in there, so what we want to do is just dot some of the raised up parts just to help bring them out, so just little areas such as around here. And once that's done, we're then back to some Vampire Fang once more, and this time this is going to be a fine highlight on the actual horse. And this is going to be all across its body. We don't need to worry about its hair so much, but we're looking at its flesh around the ear here. So sharp edges that stand out, we want to pick those out and give them a nice highlight. Also look out for any ridges where that dry brushing from earlier on may start to result in a sharper highlight appearing, such across the top of its neck going along here. And as we're going along, you see we encounter this open wound. Now the reason why we've left this highlight back to this stage is because we want to go over the top of this staining that we've just done around these wounds, where we just want to define the edges of them a little bit. So it's just a very fine highlight, don't need very much, but it just helps them pop that little bit more. So around these cracks and things, just very carefully following them around. With that, the horse's body is now fully highlighted, and so it's time to start moving on to some smaller details to move the model towards being finished off. And the first of these is going to be a really fun part for Nurgle, because it's time to paint the gross pus-filled boils. And for this, what we'll need first of all is a nice deep yellow. So we're going to need some darks and yellow for this, and then we need to go over that with a sepia wash. So we're going to use some Archaic sepia wash for this. Once that's dry, we need to make things brighter once again. So here we're going to be using some Skulker yellow. Then to finish it off, we want more of a bone colour. So we're going to use Vampire Fang once again for this. But first of all, what we need is that darks and yellow, and to apply it, again, stick to your small brush, because whilst some of the boils here are quite large and quite obvious, there are smaller ones that we need to get at the same time. So having a small brush really helps out with that. Now the obvious ones are of course these 3 that are in the shape of the mark of Nurgle, and for these what we want to do for the first step is paint the majority of them, leaving just a little bit of that burgundy still showing around the outer edge. So bring it around this sort of region just here, and you'll need to apply it just as 2 thin coats just to ensure the yellow is nice and strong before you move on. But keep an eye out for smaller boils too, because they are scattered around. So for example, there's one just here. I want to make sure we get some of these as well. Now you don't have to get all of them, but if any stand out, just be sure to pick those out as you go along. Once you're happy with all those boils being base coated, the next thing to do is apply a sepia wash over each one. So here I'm using some Archaic sepia wash, and all we want to do is just gently apply it all over like this, just to tint it into slightly more of a tobacco-y kind of colour, and also embed it in all of the surroundings. So it's just like this for the larger ones and the small ones too. The wash is dry, so now it's time to add some Skulker yellow, and I've thinned it down with a bit of water, and what we're going to do is just start applying it thinly in an almost dotting motion on top of these boils towards the middle of each one, just to steadily build up that colour in a quite a natural fashion. So we're looking for it to go on there like that, so you see the boil becomes yellower towards the middle. Now when it comes to the smaller ones, all we need to do is really just dot it once, but it's still towards the middle of each one. And then finally, we're ready for some Vampire Fang. So a light bone colour, and with this we're going to be applying it in the same sort of way as what we just did with the yellow, just a bit more focused towards the middle of each of these boils, just to make it a little bit lighter towards the top. And with that, those boils are now complete, and so we can move on to the next small detail, which is going to be that tentacle growing out the side of his head, because now it's time just to add a bit of colour to that. And for this, we're going to use a contrast paint. What I've got is some Volupus pink, and the idea here is to thin it down with a bit of water and apply it on there, and then just draw it out like we have been doing with washers, just to stain it in a particular area to go a little bit more pinky. So again, I'm going to use my small brush, back to that size 00. And with this sort of paint, because of the amount that we're diluting it by, some water will do just fine. We just want to get a few little bits of water just in there, just to take the edge off the strength of the paint and get that mixed in there, and then we're ready to apply it. And so what we need to do is apply it towards the base of the tentacle. So what we're looking at is this region around here. We just want to paint it on so it stains it with that pinky colour down to around about there. Then quickly wash your brush whilst that paint's still damp and just make sure it's just a little bit wet, and just use that to pull it down so it just fades into that colour there beneath. Now you can make this as strong as you like, and if you want the colour to be a little bit stronger, just let that first coat dry and then do a second one in the same way, but the choice is entirely up to you exactly how strong you make this colour. I applied a second coat onto that tentacle, and you can see the result. It looks something like an earthworm growing out the side of his head, so absolutely perfect for Nurgle. And with that done, we can move on to the next feature, which is going to be the red eyes on the demonic mount. Now for this, what we need first is a darker red, so I'm going to use some corn red here, and then we need to go brighter quite quickly. It's going to use some demon red, followed by some orange flare to finish it off. But first we need that corn red, and again stick to your small brush because it is eyes we're painting here, so they are quite small. All you need to do is just get a little bit of this ready on the palette, and then we can move in and start applying it. Now remember earlier on we put some of that caribou crimson around the eye, so actually we've got some recessed shading going around it already. So what we're looking for is just a ball of the eye, and all we need to do is just pick it out with this colour. With that darker red now applied, we can move on to a brighter one. So here I'm going to use some demon red, and with this all we've got to do is just paint a small circle in the middle of each eye. So essentially a little dot that's going to be around about this sort of size just here, so we get that brighter colour in the middle of each eye. And then finally, to finish off the eyes, what we need is a bright orange. So here I'm using some orange flare, and with this we just need a little dot right in the middle of each eye. With those eyes done, the next detail to paint is also going to be on the mount's face, because what we've got just down here is some dripping goo. So what we need to do is just pick that out, and we can use some Nurgle's Rot for this. Now this stage, just make sure it's quite a light sort of bonish sort of colour. So ours is still Zandri dust, which is ideal. If yours is a bit darker at this stage, be sure to paint it with something like that before you do this. But all we need now is some Nurgle's Rot, and to apply it, again I'm going for my small brush to keep it under control. And all we've got to do is just get some of this ready loaded on the brush. Don't have to thin it down at all, and it's just a matter of painting it directly over these drips. So on these ones, for example, what we want to do is apply it over it quite generously so we really get this building up and going nice and shiny, giving the impression of that dripping goo. With that done, we're now going to move on to the next detail, which is going to be on the blade of the scythe up here, because what we want to do is get a really cool rusty effect on it. And for this, we're going to do something a little bit different. What I'm going to use is some of this. This is Dirty Down Rust, and it's a great little product, this, really useful for this sort of effect. To use it, the first thing that you've got to do is to make sure it's mixed properly, because there is some, some chemical in here which does tend to settle down towards the bottom. So when you get it ready, make sure you get that ball bearing moving before you start to apply it. And what we want to do is paint this onto that scythe blade, and then what we do once it's dry is apply some water over it, and this reactivates it and means we can start playing around with it. So very easy to use. What you want is a medium-sized brush to apply it first of all, and I'm using my size 1 brush here, and you can use a palette. Don't water it down at all, just get someone there to control exactly how much is on your brush. Then all you need to do for this first step is paint it over the blade of the scythe. So what we want to do is just apply it over like this. Now this first coat is going to be this sort of yellowy brownish sort of colour, so what we want to do is just put it on there like that and get it around the base of the scythe too, so around this region just here. And you'll see it dries pretty quickly. So what we want to do is let that dry and then apply a second coat. Now this second coat is going to be a bit more focused to where we want the colour to be darker, which is going to be in this region just here. So just apply that second coat in this part to make it much more of a deep rust colour. Just bring it down to around about there and then allow it to dry. Once the paint is dry, all you need is a damp brush, and again I'm using my size 1 here, and what we do is just paint some of this water over the paint, and what this will do is start to reactivate it. So the more we wipe it, you'll see it starts to remove it, meaning we can manipulate the colour and get it to where we want it to be. So the idea is just to start wiping it away so you get it sort of a stronger colour towards the base of the scythe just there, and get lighter towards the tip. And once you're happy with that effect, we have the completed scythe blade. And as you've seen, it's really simple to get that really cool looking rusty, grimy effect. And with that done, what we're now going to do is move on to another application of rust. And it's going to be for the other metal details in the miniature with a method that's a bit easier to control. In this case, what we need is some scrag brown. And what we're going to do is really heavily thin it down on the palette. Now I'm using my small brush once again for this, so it's back to that size 00, and we just want to get this really, really watery. So add plenty of water in there to almost make it quite inky. I want to go right down to about this point just here, and with that prepared, you You're going to need a small amount on your brush, and then it's time to start dotting it onto the metal where you'd get rust collecting. So for example, in areas such as these bolts and things on this design, what we want to do is just start dotting it into those areas like that, letting it collect in recesses and just settle on the metal, and then it's just a matter of letting it dry as it will. There we go, really nice rust effect. And there we are, we've got that nice rust effect appearing there on the silver metal, but on that bronze metal what we need to do now is add a little bit of verdigris. So for this we're going to be using some Nailac oxide, and we don't need very much of it, so again stick with your small brush. I'm still using the size 00 here, and with this one what I like to do is just get a little bit of it, thin with just a little bit of water to make sure it's not going to be overwhelming, and then what we're looking for is a few recesses on the bronze details where we can just run it into those corners. So for example, if we take a look at the side of the miniature, we've got this bronze design up here on the shoulder. What we can do is just start running it into some of the corners just to give a little flash of colour on these details. Once you're happy with that verdigris as well, it's then time to move on to the last detail that we're going to add, which is going to be some stains of dust being kicked up around the bottom of the horse and all those robes and things that we got down there. And for this we just need one colour, which we're going to dry brush on. That's going to be some dust bowl. And to apply it, because we're going to dry brush it, we want a smaller dry brush. So it's back to that small dry brush from Citadel, and all we need is a small amount of this on the brush. Then as ever we just need to start working it into the bristles, and this time it needs to be a very light dry brush, so really go at it to make sure there's not much paint left on the brush. Just working your way along until you're getting to about this sort of appearance here on the texture of the paper. Then it's time to start applying it onto the bottom of the miniature, and what we're looking at really is the robes that are hanging down in areas like this, and it's just a matter of just very gently applying it to these parts, just gradually building it up, just making sure you spend a bit more time towards the very bottom so the colour gets stronger there, and a little less time as you move further up so the colour gets lighter as we move up. You can also get this bit of robe if you want to, just bring it up there, but you can see it's just a matter of carrying on until you're happy. Now with this done, you're then ready to paint the base of the miniature, and as ever it's entirely your choice what scheme you go for here, but in this case I'm going to be going for a grasslands base. And here we have the completed Harbinger of Decay, ready to go and sow Nurgle's gifts across the inhabitants of the mortal realms. So with a miniature like this, it can look very complex at first glance because there's just so much going on, but remember what you can do is approach it in quite a logical method by taking advantage of dry brushing first of all on the body of the horse, then it's a matter of turning your attention to all those other details that appear in the model. And here it's just a matter of working through them one at a time, just base coating them all in, getting them all washed and then highlighting through them. Now when it comes to the highlights, there are some details that are particularly important, and those are the robes that appear on the rider and also the armour, in particular around its face. So take your time there. This also includes the face around the horse as well, because these are real focal points that people tend to look at first, and so if you highlight them well, then it's going to lift the entire miniature. But other than that, it's just a matter of having fun with those final effects, and remember all of these can be applied to all kinds of different Nurgle miniatures. So have fun painting yours, and we'll see you again very soon.